Well, good morning, everyone. It is just a little bit past 9:30. I think we'll go ahead and start. Special shout out to those who are joining us on the podcast. It may be a little bit late in terms of a week or so just FYI. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come together this morning in your house, to study your word, to study how that word was given to us. We ask you to use that word in our lives, that we might grow in our faith connection to you, that we might better serve you in your kingdom, and to share the good news, the joy that you provide to us, that we are saved. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Amen. We are in week 4, so we're just halfway through this particular study. This really isn't a Bible study, as you probably know by now. This is sort of a study of the Bible and how it was created. And maybe just to give a little bit of opening remarks here. The development of the Bible is really complex in many respects. It's simple in many respects, but it's also very complex. It covers about 1,600 years. And it is so easy for people to get absorbed into details. You know, the details in the years. Be careful with that. What you need to do, I think, in this kind of a study is to sort of step back, look at the big picture. There's one particular slide today that I think sort of summarizes where this all is at. It's toward the end. And to help keep that big picture in mind. So just be careful about, you can always Google things and find stuff out. But it's looking at really what are all the details saying to me. So be careful about years and details and names of stuff. A lot of that stuff you'll never remember. We learned it in the seminary. So this is sort of a college course. So I probably should give you a test at the end. I could actually. That would be sort of interesting. And quite honestly, when I was teaching at college on undergraduate level, I always did open book tests in religion classes because the reality is, what's the point of having to memorize everything? Because you actually can go and Google this stuff, or you can go and look it up if you want to. It's understanding what's this all saying to me. How do you implement this into your life? So I divided this course, what the Bible, how the Bible came to be, into 3 sections. So we've got 3 2-week sessions. We're in the middle point. So we talked a couple of weeks about writing, how writing was sort of information was passed on from person to person, generation to generation in writing materials. We're right now dealing with manuscripts, which are simply just books, which we'll get in today. And then next week, the next 2 weeks, we'll talk next week about translations of the Bible, particularly the English translations. And then we'll talk the last week on hermeneutics, which is simply a seminary term for principles of biblical interpretation. How do you approach the Bible in terms of how do you interpret it to make some sense? So as I shared with you last week, what we've got today is we don't have the original copies of what Moses wrote. We've got copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, and then some translations of those copies. And what makes people nervous is, how do we know that all those copies were accurate, right? That is part of what this is all about. And again, as we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll understand that actually that can be easily answered. What biblical scholars try to do when they find all of these different copies over the centuries is to piece them all together. They compare them. It's known as textual criticism. And the word criticism isn't meant to be negative. It's textual comparison. It's taking all the copies, the fragments of copies, the pieces of copies, laying them side by side, and comparing that. If this is Isaiah 6, how does that compare over time with all these people that made those copies? That's what textual criticism is all about. So it's likely that the first translation of the Bible was the Septuagint, a word that you probably have heard. You don't need to remember it whatsoever. Actually, Steve probably does, because he's going to be learning about all this stuff. But the Septuagint, septa, 7, Septuagint means 70. It's often abbreviated LXX for 70 in Roman numerals. This is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And this is likely the first translation, possibly, of the Bible. It contains both the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, and the Apocrypha, the books that are sort of in the intertestamental times between Old Testament and New Testament. In the Septuagint, they actually throw those books into it as well. So the Second Temple period, and again, it's not so much importance of the dates and stuff. I'm giving them here just as sort of a context. But there are two temples that existed in Jewish history. The first temple was created by Solomon. He built that. It lasted until the year about 586 BC, when the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem. Remember, they carted off a bunch of people to Babylon. Daniel's among them. The Persians overtake then the Babylonians. They come to power, and they permit the Jews to go back home. So the tail end of the Old Testament is really about the return home to the ruins of Jerusalem. They're deeply saddened by that, obviously. The temple has been destroyed. Now to begin rebuilding the city, rebuilding the temple. So the Second Temple period, the existence of the Second Temple, existed between about the year 516 BC to around the year 70, because in the year 70, in the Christian era, the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem. And that's when the Second Temple was destroyed. Today, Jews want to build the Third Temple. So this is the Second Temple period. And during the Second Temple period, when the Jews came back to Jerusalem and they were rebuilding, it's likely that ancient Hebrew is sort of become somewhat lost, that people just really don't speak that, because what has happened is that the Greeks now have come to power. The Greeks start emerging in this intertestamental time. And what becomes the dominant language? Greek. What's the New Testament written in? Greek. Not a lot of people were speaking Hebrew anymore. And so what happens here is that as people drift away from Hebrew, you're going to need a translation, aren't you? And so the Old Testament, the Tanakh, is translated into Hebrew. The tradition is, and Alexander comes to power. He's, of course, Alexander the Great in around 300. He comes to power. And Greece becomes an incredible influence across the empire. It'll be a major influence during the Roman Empire because the eastern half of it will speak Greek. And they remain speaking Greek. The tradition here of why the Septuagint is called the Septuagint is this idea that the Pharaoh, the Greek Pharaoh at the time, and I think it was Ptolemy V or something like that, what he did is that he believed that the Hebrew Bible needed to be translated into Greek, largely because of this great library that had been created at Alexandria, Egypt. I mean, that was just this incredible library where they housed just documents from all over the place. The Hebrew Bible, we need to get it translated. So the tradition is, and I think it's a rather far-fetched story, but it's one I've always remembered, is that this Greek Pharaoh requested 6 people from each of the 12 tribes of Judah in Jerusalem to come to Alexandria. They put each of them sort of in a separate space, 72. They were to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. They did that, and when they all came out, all of the translations were identical. I don't know if you believe that. I have a hard time. But that's how you get the word Septuagint. They just simply rounded it off. Instead of 72, it's 70. But that's the story about how the Septuagint apparently came about, is that there was a bunch of people, 72 people that went in. They all individually translated the Hebrew Bible, and all was identical. So the Septuagint is likely the Bible that would have been around at the time of Jesus. A lot of quotes in the New Testament of the Old Testament are word for word out of the Septuagint. So it's obvious that there was a translation that was floating around at the time of Jesus. There's also an Aramaic translation of the Old Testament, of the Tanakh. It's called the Targum. You may have heard of that. in tradition, it is the fact that as Hebrew sort of evaporated, ancient Hebrew, the being able to speak it, if you're in an assembly and you're sharing the word of God or the word from God, and if generally people aren't speaking Hebrew, they're speaking another language. I mean, it was like when I grew up, my family, my mother's side of it, we're all Catholic. I think I've mentioned it before. And so I went to a lot of Catholic masses with them when I was young. And that was when masses were still in Latin. And my grandparents didn't know Latin. And here they are sitting in church, and everybody, I mean, it's like, do you understand what they're saying? Yeah, you do. Everybody stands up, everybody stands up. So in this intertestamental time, if Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, is sort of disappearing in the ability of people being able to understand it, rabbis and sort of the learned folks started to share the word of God in Aramaic, which is it's very close to Hebrew. I mean, the letters are actually the same. It's pronounced a little bit different. But they started to speak it orally. And it was actually against sort of the religious rules to write any of that down. I mean, the sacred text was Hebrew. But over time, the Aramaic version is written down. And there is an Aramaic Old Testament Bible. When the Dead Sea Scrolls, whenever you see DSS in my slides, that means Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, when they were found in the 1940s, actually, they found some sections of this Aramaic Bible in Job and in Leviticus. So it's likely that was also circulating around the time of Jesus. But it's more likely that actually the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh at the time of Jesus was the Septuagint. I shared this a little bit last week, and let's talk about this, because this is actually a really important diagram, sort of a timeline that one needs to understand. Again, don't get lost in the details. It's sort of the big picture that you got to step back and look at. That bar, that colored bar, the red or the orange on the left represents time, the passage of time. So the red or the orange is before Christ. The green side would be on the New Testament side. And so we know that Jesus' ministry, that he was probably crucified age 33, 34, someplace in there. He was crucified and, of course, resurrected, and he was ascended into heaven. It's not clear when the New Testament letters were written, the New Testament documents. We don't have dates on Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those kinds of things. It's a guess. There's some belief that the Gospels start to get written in the 40s, about a decade or so after Jesus. I mean, there seems to be a need to know what are the sayings of Jesus. But then John, likely for the book of Revelation, is toward the end of the first century. So this area right here just represents when it's possible that the New Testament books were written over a period of maybe 50, 60 years, maybe a little bit longer. What's important here is that someplace toward the end of the second century, the late 100s, a list of the books started to emerge that were considered sacred in the New Testament. There's a document known as the Muratorian Fragment. It's just a piece. And I'll show you a picture of it in just a few minutes. It lists 23 of the 27 books of the New Testament as God's Word. So the list, the canon, started to emerge at the end of the second century. Irenaeus, you may have heard of him. He was a bishop back in second century, a very important guy. We've got a lot of writings from this guy. He lists them as well. And so these documents in 170 and 180 are, for what we know of right now, the earliest list that we have of what the New Testament books may have been. It isn't until about a century and a half, 2 centuries later, that Athanasius, the Athanasian Creed, though Athanasius didn't write the creed, he was a bishop, sort of puts out the 27 books. So the date for when the 27 books of the New Testament get sort of formalized seems to be around the year 400 or the late 300s. And that is confirmed by a council around 400.
The 4 books Were they the same 4 books?
Yes, the 4 books. So the 4 books are always the question, okay, what was left out? We're going to come back to this one, the Gnostic Gospels, because that's actually, I think, one of the reasons that somebody decided we better make a list. We better decide what's in the New Testament. So the Muratorian Fragment, which is just a piece, it's just a piece of a document. The first part of it is missing. It is what we believe is the oldest known list of the New Testament books. It was discovered in the 1600s in a library in Milan. It mentions, so from a dating standpoint, it mentions a bishop by the name of Pius I, so Roman Catholics, that would have been probably considered a pope. It is a fragment. It's got 85 lines to it, likely written around the year 170. It lists 23 books of the New Testament as part of the sacred writings. What it leaves out is Hebrews and James, 2 books that Luther had problems with, but he included them, and then 1st and 2nd Peter. Everything else is there. But those 4 books missing from Irenaeus and from the Muratorian Fragment. I don't know what happens over a period of a century and a half, 2 centuries, when Athanasius decides to make the list, but those 4 books are on it then. That sort of solves it. There's 27, that's God's Word. This is the Muratorian Fragment. It is in Greek. It was discovered in the 1600s. Again, it's the earliest list that we've got. Okay, going back to this one. This will get a little bit confusing, but again, don't get lost in details. To me, this is the only point of this whole segue is that somebody decided we better make a list because there's other books that are starting to appear that purport to be from God. And these are what's known as the Gnostic Gospels. And they've only been recently discovered, actually. We know that they existed, now that some of this stuff has been uncovered. But the Gnostic Gospels, and you can see where that bracket is, they spread over a period of about the middle of the 2nd century to the middle of the 4th century or so. Actually, the Gnostic heresy, or the Gnostic era, is still around today. It's still around today. But it became a big issue for the church in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. This is a heresy. This is false doctrine. So the Gnostic Gospels are a collection of 13 books. These are some of them. They were written, and that's an error right there. That should be CE, not the B in there. But they're written between the middle of the 2nd century to the middle of the 4th century, the 300s. Probably of the most interesting book that's been discovered is the Gospel of Thomas. You can read this stuff online. It's all posted now. But the Gospel of Thomas is fascinating because it purports to be about 114 sayings from Jesus, quotes from Jesus. Some of them are actually in the Gospels. Many of them are not. So Athanasius rejected these books back in the end of the 300s. They were discovered, though, in 1945 in Egypt, and they were finally published in the 1970s. It's raised a lot of questions because, the Gospel of Mary these are fascinating. Some of them are relatively short, but if you want to read them, they're actually online that you can Google them. This is the Gospel of Thomas, the beginning of it. You can't see it very well there. That's Thomas in Greek. So 114 quotes from Jesus. And it begins by saying, these are the hidden words that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote them down. Well, we know Didymus, don't we, from the Gospels? Didymus, the twin, Thomas had a twin. So what these documents allegedly are is that people continued to write and to share their thoughts about Jesus and about the teachings. It ended up becoming a heresy. Gnosis or Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a teaching, it's a heresy. And gnosis in Greek means knowledge. And this is all about getting special knowledge. It's a mystical kind of thing. It's a special knowledge that you get if you're sort of connected with God. And so this developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And at the heart of it all is this idea that the physical world that you can touch, that you can hold, is inferior. It's evil. And the way that you know that is because when people die, they decay. In fact, people die. If this was the perfect world, that wouldn't happen. Die, go back to dust. That's inferior. So God could not have created the world that we live in. Some lesser God did. You can see where this starts to get into heresy now. And so humans then are trapped in this physical body. We're trapped. And the only way to get salvation is to get the special knowledge that's revealed. And the Redeemer has come to reveal that knowledge to us. What really probably set the alarm bells off is this fact that Jesus was not incarnate. He did not become a human being. That he was more like an angel. He was an apparition. You thought you saw Jesus, but it wasn't in flesh and blood. Because if he was in flesh and blood, he would decay. Flesh and blood is bad. What you want to become is a special knowledge connected with God. This is the Gnostic error, the Gnostic heresy. Some of this is still around in some belief systems. But it started to be developed in these writings that emerged in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And the folks that were in charge of the Christian community at the time said, these are problems, because that's not what we believe. Somebody better decide what the books are, because there's others that are popping up. And that's why the Gnostic heresy or the Gnostic error becomes really important in the life of the Christian church. It forces, I believe, the decision, we better have some creeds to make the statement of what we believe, and we better identify what the sacred texts are that we connect with Jesus.
So today, nowadays, you're agnostic. That means you're not able to know the truth. You know what the truth is.
Yeah, I mean, yes, agnostic would be, it could or couldn't be.
You know, my truth is just as valid as yours.
Yes, yeah.
So you're agnostic, and it's like being an atheist.
So, yes, I would tend to put, yeah. Yes. The agnosticism is this, you can't know. Because God is so, I mean, if there is a God, he's so out of our dimension that we can't connect with him anyway. Yeah. So, there is a need to start circulating documents. The Christian church is growing now in the New Testament time. And so what do you do? Well, not everybody could write. I mean, they certainly were literate, but they couldn't necessarily write. And so professional scribes emerge. Professional scribes are emerging in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And in the Middle Ages, particularly in the Middle Ages, probably 4, 5, 6 centuries after Jesus, we have the development of what's known as scriptoriums, where scribes get together, maybe a few scribes, because remember, there is no printing press. The printing press is invented in the 1400s, the movable type thing with Gutenberg. In fact, one of the first things he'll print is a Bible, the Gutenberg Bible. But you have a need for mass production. You need to produce the documents. And what are you going to do? I mean, even if you had the original document for Moses, what do? Pass that around to everybody? I mean, that just doesn't make sense. You want to make some copies, don't you? Can you copy that for me? And so where do you go to copy? You don't have a copy machine, but you got some people who are professional writers who can write it for you, who can copy it for you. And so these copiers become the mass producers. They become the Xerox machines up until the 1400s. And it's interesting because not all of the scribes had good spelling. And so if there's a guy standing up in front and reading it word for word for word, and you're sitting there writing, I mean, maybe you actually missed hearing something clearly, or maybe you wrote the word and you wrote it differently from what it was, you can actually see those in the copies of the copies of the copies. That's what's interesting about textual criticism, is that sometimes you can actually identify the scribe that made that copy because he has misspelled it all the way through. And it doesn't change the meaning of the words. It doesn't change the meaning of the text. That sometimes really makes people nervous. Well, if there's some misspelled words in some of the copies, this is now not legit. No, it's okay. We understand. That's a misspelling, folks. So as the church grows, these scriptoriums started to emerge, and just monks that were, particularly in monasteries, they had a lot of time on their hands. They started to do a lot of the copying up till the 1400s, and then 1440 is when Gutenberg has this movable type printing press. And again, one of the first things that he produces is the Gutenberg Bible. Now you can mass produce. So now if you've actually got it, if you're copying something that has an error in it, a misspelling, then you've got mass copies of it now starting to circulate. That's actually one of the things that becomes somewhat of an issue. We know Paul had scribe. Paul uses scribes to copy things. He didn't necessarily do the writing himself. And so in Romans 16, we know at the very end of it, I, Tertius, who write this letter, greet you in the Lord. He throws that in there. Maybe Paul said, send your greeting. In Colossians 4, Paul was making a point. And he says in Colossians 4, I, Paul, write this with my own hand. Paul was apparently literate. He could write. But he uses a scribe, I think, to be able to write the document. Even in the Old Testament, Jeremiah had a scribe, had a secretary, Baruch. This is an interesting one. So Jeremiah called Baruch, son of Neriah, and while Jeremiah dictated all the words the Lord had spoken to him, Baruch wrote them on the scroll. And he actually does this for a reason, because in Jeremiah 36, then Jeremiah told Baruch, I'm restricted. I am not allowed to go to the Lord's temple. Remember, Jeremiah has a lot of issues. He isn't really being accepted by the people. So you go to the house of the Lord on a day of fasting, and what are you going to do? Read to the people from the scroll the words of the Lord. God spoke to me. We wrote them down. You go and read them to people, because that's as good as God speaking it to you. You can see that pathway from God to humanity through this kind of a thing. So the New Testament manuscripts, there are a lot of them, actually. There's a lot of copies of copies of copies. Probably they were originally on papyrus, because that probably in the long run was earlier cheaper than parchment and the more expensive vellum papers. A manuscript is simply just a handwritten document. So when you're talking about a manuscript, and it's abbreviated MSS, when you talk about a manuscript, it's simply just a handwritten document versus a printed book. How long does a papyrus roll last? Well, it depends on how much you roll it up and down. Depends on who treats it. You throw it around, you roll it. If it's sacred, then it's going to be cared for. But even over time, as you unroll it and you read it, and maybe you touch it, or you hold a pointer and you slip and you poke through it. These things get damaged. It's estimated that probably a papyrus roll could probably last about a decade or more before it needed to be recopied, or you needed to get a new copy. But this list here, the numbers, is in the New Testament. This is just New Testament. We've got about 25,000 manuscripts, handwritten documents of the Bible, various pieces of it. So there's about 6,000 Greek manuscripts, about 10,000 in Latin, about 10,000 in other languages. There are manuscripts. There's not just one or two that have survived. There's actually quite a few that have. And so this is where textual criticism becomes important. You can lay all of these things across the table and you can start comparing. Well, what does this one say in Isaiah 7? Like this one here, which seems to be older. Are they saying the same things? Are they using the same words? Because that's actually what everybody's always interested in. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, is that the same word that's used over here 2 centuries later? How faithful were the scribes? You know the telephone game. That if you're going to speak something to somebody and you started out, we always did that in youth, by the time you got to the end of the line, the story was different. Isn't that what one thinks about with scribes? And that's really not the case. Scribes were very much into, if you speak to me this word, I faithfully need to write it down. The manuscript who has got custody is a good question. They're sort of all over the place in the world. It depends on how much money people have, because you can buy some of them. Some of them are in libraries with perpetual care, but some of them are owned by private individuals. And so there's two types of manuscripts. There's what's known as uncials. Those are manuscripts that are all in capital letters and no space between the words. I showed you a picture of that last week. I'll show you again. But they're, and you know why they didn't put spaces in. It's to save papyrus. It's to save the parchment, because it's too expensive. And then there is another version called minuscules. And just as the name mini would imply, those are small cursive letters. And actually, they've got some spaces in between. Of these two types of manuscripts, the uncials, the capital letters with no spaces, would likely be older, because that was saving paper. The ones that have space in between them and are lowercase, which actually lengthened out the document, likely would be newer. And so we've got about, and these are sort of estimates, about 650 of these uncials, about 4,600 minuscules. So this is an uncial. This is a Greek manuscript. This is a copy of a copy. This is a Greek manuscript, all in capital letters. And you can see here, they put paragraphs in. So they're divided by topic. That's sort of interesting. This is a minuscule. You can see the difference. This is almost like cursive writing. I mean, you know how to print, but you know that script writing actually, it sort of takes a little more length here to write it all out. If you print, you can probably compress it in a shorter period, or shorter path. In this particular document, you can see that there's annotations that are here and there. There's a variety of them. I mean, the person who was copying this, some of the scribes made annotations in the document that they were writing, that they were copying. I'll show you an example of that in the Vatican one.
With the minuscules, is it kind of like favorite passages that are included if it doesn't have the entire Testament? Like, oh, this part isn't that important, so we're not going to include it, or is it more?
In minuscules, is it selective in terms of what verses are? Minuscules come in different varieties. Some of them are just a book. They're not necessarily taking, this is a list of my favorite passages. They generally will take a section, if they want to present it to somebody, or a book. There are very few minuscules, New Testament Bibles that exist just because of length. So the New Testament manuscripts, these are the three that are the most important to us. Our translation, the English translation of the Bible, comes from these three documents. And you do not have to be a biblical scholar to understand where they may be or where they were found. They are codexes. Codexes are books. We got Vaticanus in the Vatican. We've got Sinaiticus that was discovered in Mount Sinai. And we've got Alexandrius, which is probably from Alexandria, Egypt, from the library. Those are the most complete three Bibles that exist today. You can actually see them. I've seen all three. It's amazing. So let's talk just quickly about each of these. Codex Vaticanus. This is located in the Vatican. It is believed that this document, this book, this Bible, was copied around the 300s. It's located in the Vatican Museum. It's been there since 1481, except for a time when Napoleon came to power and stole it, took it to Paris, and it was returned in 1815. It's been there since. They protect it. And if you go to the Vatican Museum, you get to be able to see it. They turn pages every day so you can see different parts of it. What's interesting about this, it's all in Greek, so you've got the Old Testament, the Tanakh, you've got the Old Testament and New Testament all in Greek. There's parts that are missing. The beginning of the Bible is actually missing. It starts in Genesis 46, verse 28. The tail end of the Bible is missing, and they lost some of the Psalms. The pages are numbered, so we know how many pages were in it. But in ancient books, I mean, you know, if bindings fall apart, and you might have had that, you know, books at home, and bindings fall apart, you lose some of the pages sometimes. And if you got other copies, who really cares in the end? Because we got a newer copy down the hallway. And so the front end of this document, this copy is missing, and the tail end of it is missing. You can actually see this in the Vatican Library. Well, actually, all three of these are online. I mean, so you can actually page through these if you want. There's a digital copy online for all of these. The Vatican Library is located to the right here. If you ever get to the Vatican, the Pope has his weekly message from right there. Sort of an interesting moment in time. This is Codex Vaticanus. And as you can see, it's incredibly thick, isn't it? This is a thick document. I mean, look at the binding. And you know if you're going to open it up and close it all the time, the binding's going to fall apart. Because what did they do? This isn't professional binding per se. I mean, this is sewing it together. It gives out. You need a new copy.
It does look very neat, though.
It is. It looks very neat. Sure, they open it up. I mean, what exists today is sort of neat. Some of it's in color, so they were using some color ink. There are notations in the document by the scribe who copied this. And we don't know whether or not these notations were in a previous copy that the scribe was using to copy. Could be. Somebody put in some notations. And apparently somebody had a lot to say about a section out of John, because these are all marginal notes that are around this copy. That's what's fascinating about textual criticism, about comparing copies. When you find these kinds of things, it's just fascinating. Go, what other things are in this document?
Do the marginal notes refer back to other books, or is it just marginal notes on what was transcribed?
What do the marginal notes refer to? It varies. It depends on who's making comments. Sometimes it's related to what's on that page. Some of it may refer back to something that was in a previous book. But clearly the scribes had some opinions and some thoughts. So while they were faithful to copying the copy, some were giving some commentary. And they're sort of interesting to read, if you can decipher it, because sometimes these documents are hard to decipher. What's interesting about Codex Vaticanus, if you've got a Bible, you've got Bibles in the pew. If you turn to page 853 in the Bible you've got there, Mark 16, the end of the book of Mark. If you end the book of Mark where it ends in Codex Vaticanus, Jesus is dead and there's no reference to the resurrection. So what is that? There's other Bibles that actually add the resurrection into it. On page, it's page 853. Note there on the right column. What does it say in that little thing there, in the small type? Some of the earliest manuscripts do not include Mark 16, 9 through 20. Codex Vaticanus is interesting because actually what it does is that it leaves a place for it.
What?
It leaves a place for it. Did the copyists know that actually there's more to the story and it needs to be added in? Because that's what this place is about, I believe. You don't leave this kind of a space in an expensive papyrus or expensive parchment. And so in Mark 16 is an interesting one because the way that abruptly ends, you would think, well, isn't the whole point of Christianity that Jesus comes back to life? Wouldn't you want to write that, Mark? Did somebody in the end come back and say, well, Mark just didn't finish this, we need to finish it for him? Don't know. Did God move somebody to write it in? Codex Sinaiticus, Fascinating story about how this was discovered. There was a Bible scholar by the name of Konstantin Tischendorf, who's a German. He visited St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. There is a monastery there, still there. It was a monastery that was built in about 550, so about 5 centuries after Jesus. It's believed, their story is, that they built the monastery over the site where Moses and the burning bush took place. We don't know, because I don't believe there was a sign there that says this is where that happened, but who knows. So Tischendorf, who was a Greek scholar, published a Greek New Testament based upon all of the documents that he had. He published that in 1841. And then he visited this monastery at St. Catherine's in 1844. And lo and behold, when he went into the library, he discovered that the monks in that library were using this old book for kindling. They were tearing out pages and using it to start fires. He looked at some of the documents, some of the pages, and it was the Bible. And he pleaded with them, can I have this document? And the monks wouldn't let him have it. This story is painful because you've got some of this codex, this Bible, the Sinai Bible, that is being used to start fires, because apparently they didn't really understand what the value of this document was, apparently. But it wasn't until 1859 that he was finally able to convince the monks, can I borrow this copy and make a copy, and I'll give it back to you. He never returned it. It's in the British Museum today, thankfully, maybe, because I think they began to understand this must be valuable, so they didn't burn anymore, apparently. But the reality is that once Tischendorf got it, he made a copy. He gave the copy to Tsar Alexander II in Russia. It was published in 1862. It was in 4 volumes, because these are huge, huge documents. And again, it was never returned. You can see this actually in the British Museum. It's believed to be copied around the middle of the 300s. This one is believed to be the oldest Bible that survives today. It's not all there. There's pieces, of course, that were used for kindling. So we got pages missing because some monk decided to start a fire with it. But the original had 730 pages. About 400 of them survive. It's about 15 inches square. It comes in 4 columns. Remember the Vatican document? The Vatican copy was in 3 columns. This is in 4. This is St. Catherine's. It's at the base of Mount Sinai. This is believed to be Mount Sinai that Moses would have hiked up a couple of times. This is the inside, the church part. This is the cleaned up library at St. Catherine's. Apparently it was in really pretty shoddy condition when Tischendorf visited, but since then they do understand the value of the documents that they have. This is the oldest library that we believe still in existence in the world. This has been consistent going on since the 500s. So this is Codex Sinaiticus. This is an uncial, as you can see. It's got all capital letters. And then we got Alexandrius. This codex was known to have been in Alexandria, Egypt. In the 1600s, it's taken to Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. The copy was given to King Charles I in England in 1627. And of course, as good English, they would give it to the British Museum, which has a lot of treasures in it. And that's also on display there as well. It's fascinating when you go into the British Museum and you look at both Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, is the fact that they're so, you'd expect it to be in this big, a big room just dedicated to it. No, actually, it's just right here. Oh, well, this is Sinaiticus. It's just right there in that little glass cage. This had 773 pages to it. And it dates back to the 400s. So this is a little bit older, or it's a little bit newer in our timeline. And so how many columns in this one? 2. 2 columns. This is, interestingly, an index of the chapters in Mark. This goes back to the 400s. Somebody decided to index Mark. Each of the books are indexed. 2 columns. You can see all the notations that scribes have made on this. And what's interesting about this is that it's got pictures. The scribe isn't a particularly good drawer, and we don't really know what all these pictures and doodlings are all about, but it seems to be a little bit older if you're going to get sticking graphics into it, because you can afford to, apparently, because you can afford the papyrus or the parchment. If you're interested in when chapters and verses are stuck into the Bible, obviously God didn't pass those things on. People have inserted those over the centuries, partly so that you can reference the Bible easier. The Hebrew Bible was in ancient times divided into paragraphs or into subjects or topics. But there was a rabbi in 1448 that actually put verse numbers into the Tanakh, into the Hebrew Bible. In the New Testament in the 4th century, we have the New Testament, it seems to be grouped in paragraphs or topics, but it isn't until 1227 that actually chapters are inserted into the text. And that's done by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And then in 1555, a printer in Paris decided to insert verses in the New Testament. And so verses get involved there. And what that has enabled then is to be able to study it. You can reference it. What did Mark say? I mean, can you imagine trying to tell you where something is at in the Bible if there's no chapters or verse numbers? How in the world? Go about a third of the way through. Let's see if we can find that section. I mean, it's surprising, actually, it took that many centuries for somebody to figure out, why don't you just put chapters or verse numbers in these things? But they eventually do. So the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, this is Jerusalem. There is a place known as Qumran, which is on the northwestern side of the Dead Sea in Israel. It's about 25 miles from Jerusalem, depending on how you travel there. It's about 6 miles south from Jericho. You can see how small Israel is. But you've got the Dead Sea in Qumran. This is Qumran. This is the ancient site of Qumran that seems to have been what's known as an Essene community. What many people believe was sort of an early group of monks. This community existed between roughly about 150 years before Jesus to roughly around 70 when the Romans came through and destroyed. So this is Qumran. Again, it's a group of monks. And what people have come to believe about Qumran is that this was a group of folks, probably very conservative individuals, who were concerned about the Hellenization of the empire, of Judaism. That Jews are being too influenced by Greek culture. And so they decided to isolate themselves or to go somewhat into seclusion. They gathered a library. A lot of it is just ancient Hebrew documents. I think it's partly to preserve the story so that it doesn't get intruded upon by all of that Greek, all the modern stuff that's out there. And that library existed. It was destroyed by the Romans in 68-73, somewhere in there. And then they head south and they get Masada. So this is the Dead Sea is back here. This is the Qumran community. If you walk out to where that arrow is at, where those people are located, and then turn west, this is what you see. It's mountains, huge mountains. And lo and behold, up in the mountains, what the monks did, or what the Essenes did as the Romans were coming through and destroying, because they must have heard that the Romans are moving and they're coming our way, they hid the library in the mountains. Thank goodness. So one would think, this is one of those moments in life I remember very clearly standing here and looking at that, because you see a couple of caves that are just so obvious. I mean, why didn't they discover the scrolls earlier? But that's actually not where they found the scrolls in the first place. They find the scrolls way up in the mountains. This is cave number 1, that's way up in the mountains. And you can't see it very clear here because it's not dark enough, but where that green circle is at, those are some people standing there. So you get some idea of just how mammoth this place is. So why didn't you discover the scrolls? Well, you go into the mountains and try to find caves. And especially if you were hiding the documents, would you simply leave the cave open? No way. You're going to cover the cave up, aren't you? So how do you find the cave? So this is Cave 1. This was discovered in 1946. It was finally excavated in 1949. As the story goes, there were a couple of Bedouins. These were the folks that live out, or shepherds that live in tents. In 1946, by Juma and Mohammed Ed Dib, and actually he's the guy that actually gathered the scrolls. He was actually known as Muhammad the Wolf. He has since changed. He changed his name after that. But they were doing. The legend goes is that they were looking for some stray goat, and when they were looking for the stray goat up in the mountains, they were throwing rocks into caves. They heard a sound of a broken, something breaking, so they went in and investigated. And lo and behold, they found some broken clay jars with documents in it. They gather some of the documents and they take them with them. This is a picture of the two guys. They were teenagers at the time. They take him to Bethlehem to an antiquities dealer. Doesn't that look like an ancient antiquities dealer with that little round hat? I love that one. He bought them for $10. $10. And only to discover it was probably the most significant archaeological find of modern times. $10. They didn't know what they really had. I mean, that was part of the problem, part of the issue. So.
Luckily they weren't cold and used it for fire.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, actually, that was one of the thoughts, because they had hung them up in the tents. I mean, as they describe it, they were hanging them up in the tents, and actually some thought that they were going to use it for kindling, because it was, something that could burn. And in the end, they take it to Jerusalem just to check them out, and the antiquities dealer says, "Sure, I'll buy them off of you." And so what do? Well, you go back to the mountains and you try to find more, right? And so this is how the pots likely would have looked. So between 1946 and 1956, 11 caves were discovered. There are about 1,000 documents that have been discovered as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They date back to as early as around 400 years before the time of Jesus, which is important. We know that they end when the Romans come through and destroy the place. So after the news got out, there were a lot of treasure hunters. When people discovered what this all meant, they started to rummage through the hills to try to find these caves. What intruded in all of this is the War of Independence in Israel between 48 and 49, which sort of slowed this process down. That's why Cave 1 wasn't really fully excavated until 1949. But over that period of time, these are what the caves look like today. The entrances have been all uncovered now, or at least the ones that we found. This is a condition of some of what the scrolls look like, so you can see the challenges that a biblical scholar would have of unrolling this thing. And some of them are in good shape, some of them are not so good a shape. There are some papyruses. This is what a lot of it looks like. It's just fragments. It's like putting together a puzzle. Where do all these fragments fit into place? If you were around in 1954 and read the Wall Street Journal, they were selling some of the documents. This is an ad. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Send us a letter. So they were selling some of the documents at 54. So in 1965, Israel built what has been called the Book of the Shrine of the Book, a beautiful place that houses some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are sort of all over the place, but many of them are housed in Israel. Originally, there were 7 scrolls. A handful of scholars started to work on them, trying to conserve them, trying to document them, trying to interpret them. It was a slow process. I remember even in the seminary, there was no published documents from the Dead Sea Scrolls when I went through the seminary. It was like, when are you guys ever going to publish these things? And finally, Israel took over the process in the 1990s. And quite honestly, the first English copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls finally emerged at the turn of the century. I mean, almost a half a century after they were discovered. They finally are published. This is the Shrine of the Book, an amazing museum. When I was there the first time, they still had the original Isaiah document around in that circle thing. It's like the Declaration of Independence. It sinks into the ground in case the building is in danger. But it's amazing to look at these documents. The contents, most of them are religious documents. Not necessarily biblical, but they're religious in nature. They may have calendars, religious calendars, rabbi comments, and textual kinds of things. About 25% of them are actually parts of the Tanakh. They are in Greek and Aramaic. The contents are in what have been discovered so far in 4 languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. Some of the documents actually have dates on them, so scholars know when they were created, contracts and things like that. Some of them have been dated by carbon-14. About 80% of them are on leather. About 20% are on papyrus. You can actually see digital copies of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls now online. So the scrolls include everything, parts of every book of the Tanakh, except Esther. Esther has not been found in any of the documentation. There's no New Testament text, as one would expect. I mean, if the Essenes were actually trying to exclude themselves from sort of modern society, you probably would view Christianity as a sect. And why would you want to get involved in that?
Pastor, did the people before the Goatherders discovered this, did they know the historical significance of this area, and why were people out there excavating?
There really was no understanding of it. No. That's why, it's 1946, 47, we're not even a century past that yet. I mean, this is modern kind of stuff, isn't it? We discover some new stuff.
What makes me ask why it wouldn't have been discovered earlier?
Why wasn't it early discovered?
It wasn't known that area.
I think part of it is the fact that the cave openings, I think, were covered. And so you wouldn't expect, did somebody bury something out there? There's a lot of ancient sites that haven't even been excavated yet. Part of it is money. Who's got the money to go in and spend the time excavating things? So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, then Qumran became important. Then you go in and excavate. You'll find the money to do that. This is the most important slide from today. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, almost a complete copy of Isaiah was found. That's why it was on that circle thing in the Shrine of the Book. It is the oldest copy of Isaiah. And in fact, it's 1,200 years older than the oldest copy that existed before this thing was discovered. It's almost identical to the copies that were around in the 900s. Is God working in that? You bet you. Are the scribes faithful to copying? You bet they must have been. They weren't taking a lot of license of rewriting some stuff. That Isaiah scroll is important. I mean, not just as a historical document, but to demonstrate scribes are faithful when they copy stuff. They may make some mistakes or errors, but quite honestly, they took their job seriously over all those centuries. 1,200 years. There's been another cave that was discovered in 2017. Nothing really in it. They went in. They found some fragments in again when they went back and sifted through. But apparently looters got into this cave that they discovered in 2017. You can see some pictures here of them in the cave. This is what they found: a lot of broken jars. They found one blank papyrus. They found some pickaxes that they believe date back to the 1940s. So likely these are treasure hunters that are trying to find. They found a blank scroll. But this is how they would have been stored. The Dead Sea Scrolls had been rolled up, shoved into a clay pot, cap put on them, probably sitting upright or even sideways. And so when the goat herders were throwing rocks into it, it's likely that the rock hit one of those clay jars, broke. They could hear it. So when you go to Qumran and you look up in the mountains, it's sort of the question, what else is out there? What else is out there? The Israeli government is really working now to go and re-excavate all of the sites and to look for even more things, because what's a concern now is that actually there's forgeries that are starting to come onto the market, purporting to be from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're not. And if you really feel ambitious, you can go and hike it now. You can hike to the caves. This is a hiking map. So that's manuscripts. It's the Isaiah scroll that is so significant. You know that if Isaiah, that scroll, 1,200 years earlier than the newest one we had, is almost identical to what we got now, what's the problem? You know, the faithfulness of the word has gone through. Okay, any quick questions?
There's more significance than just elastic to the Isaiah scroll. Even in the building where we saw the giant scroll handles, Isaiah presents the gospel to the Jews so clearly in 53. And so for them to have that ascended significance, God knows why it was preserved.
Yes, very clearly. I mean, there's so much more that this fans out into. You know, I think for the purpose of the development of the Bible, where people have issues maybe with, were the scribes actually doing faithful job copying from generation to generation? Yeah, apparently they did. And so now dig deeper. So what is that story that Isaiah told? That's what, then you can dig into it, the reliability of that text. This isn't something Christians, you know, came up with, you know, years later. Larry?
When the Spaniards came to the Americas, and they took over the Mayans and the Aztecs and all that, they intentionally destroyed all of these writings and wonderful artifacts because they wanted to rid the culture of those heathen documents. Given the vulnerability of Israel with the Muslims and the conflicts going on, is Israel really the best place for these things to be kept right now and stored? Or is there a sense, even amongst the Israelis, that these would be better housed in another place?
Well, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are sort of all over. Some are here in the U.S. I mean, the vulnerability of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Shrine of the Book is really pretty much a fortress, you know, in terms of preserving it. I'm not sure that it's a big worry. I mean, it's guarded, it's protected. It would be like, you know, how vulnerable is the copy of the Declaration of Independence in Washington. I mean, I suppose if somebody wanted to blow it up, they could. I don't know, you know. But at least some of the documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually around the world in various places. A lot of them are actually here in the United States. But they've been published. I mean, so even if something is destroyed, the reality is we've got the digital copy and we've got the printed version now. So before the 1990s, we didn't. I mean, then that was even more vulnerable, probably.